Today we're joined by Weston Zimmerman. This is interesting, Weston. I'm gonna have to get used to this. We don't do video on the How to Hardscape podcast, so this is really great to see. I see my face in this one. This is awesome. Weston Zimmerman, co-founder and CEO of SynkedUp, a project management software system. Weston, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, hey, thanks for doing this. I was looking forward to this. Stephanie was helping us line this up, and we're up here at the Landscape Ontario show, and we're literally here recording this in the lobby of the hotel. So
yeah,
make it happen wherever you're at.
It's great that you make the trip up to Ontario here. This is your second time at Congress? Yeah, that's great. And just to see your face and seeing you at all these different industry events and how much SynkedUp has helped this industry, and you yourself is kind of that push towards helping these contractors. I've always kind of had that connection with you that I really appreciate what you do for the industry. I just want to get that out of the way very first thing with that. But that being said, Weston, putting you at the hot seat right away, what's one thing that our audience or the landscape industry, people that even know you, may not know about you? What's something that you can give us that's interesting about you?
Well, there's definitely people that know this, but maybe at large not. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania in the Appalachian Mountains in a conservative horse and buggy Mennonite community. So I grew up with zero technology.
Wow.
And we had electricity, but no tech of any sort, not even cameras or anything.
Yeah.
And my first 2 years of working at Tussie Landscaping, I had no driver's license because of that, and I biked to work.
Wow.
12 miles one way.
No way.
Yep. And so, yeah, that was how I grew up. Tech wasn't really a part of my life until my mid to later teens, really.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I didn't know that about you. That's great.
How's that? Does that work for the answer?
That works awesome, man. So where does technology start to come into your life?
Well,
what's the catalyst for that?
Well, that's a good question. So basically, my dad had a electrical contracting business that then started doing fiber optic in the 90s.
Okay.
When the fiber optic internet boom was kind of happening, which then led into technical, like phone systems, security systems, cameras. So even though we were in this horse and buggy Mennonite community, at his work, at his business, they were installing technology.
Yeah.
So we lived without it at home.
Okay.
But he installed it for a living. So I was around tech in that regard.
Right.
And then what happened is when I started working for Tussie Landscaping, I left that community where I grew up at.
Okay.
And at that point I started actually using technology, got the standard, cell phone cameras, all that kind of thing. And when I was working at Tussie Landscaping, we were trying to get off of pen and paper. I researched and bought products and set them up inside of Tussie Landscaping. That was kind of a project I let out. I kind of wanted to do things. I wanted to have responsibility, or I wanted to do things, and that was something like, knock yourself out. So I kind of got sucked in or pulled into what tech can do in the real world through that exercise.
Got it. So quite a 180 to today, having a software and all of this technology around us.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's quite the journey. That's awesome. Wow. And then you start working for Tussie, and what's that journey like towards, fill us in from the start of working for Tussie to starting SynkedUp.
Yeah, so I started working for Tussie when I was 16. Before that, what got me into Tussie, before that, I had been working for my uncle at his cabinet shop, building kitchens.
Oh yeah.
And cabinetry. And I enjoyed the craftsmanship of that, but I didn't like being inside, and I hated the finishing room, like the painting and all of that. Mm-hmm. So I ran into Matt, which is one of the owners of Tussie Landscaping.
Right.
Steve and Matt are brothers. And I was like, I could see myself doing that, because I grew up on where I grew up, it was like a 15-acre property. So I was the one that would just stripe that lawn and mulch all the flower beds and plant all the trees. I loved doing that. So I was like, I could see myself doing that. And I called Matt out of the blue one day and asked him if we're hiring, and he's like, well, how would you get here? Because he knew I didn't have a license. He's like, I'll bike, no problem, 12 miles, no, that's a big deal. And so I started working for Tussie. And that would have been in 2007. And it was probably 2012 to 13 to 14 when I was doing what I was telling you earlier about trying to get Tussie off of paper. Like, I was the first one to do like service call, like manage service calls and stuff on water features and stuff at Tussie. And so everything at that time was totally on paper. Yeah. So it was just all the reasons that doesn't work was what the life we were living. And so I started researching other products, and started using some products that we really liked. But the challenge is if they were really good in the front field with scheduling and client communications, they had no financials. Or if they had financials, they were tougher on the front field side of things. And so to fast forward a lot of details very quickly, in that process where we use this product, then that product, then this product, plus spreadsheets, plus QuickBooks, plus in this maze of products to try to kind of get a whole suite around our project life cycle.
Right.
I came home from work. Well, my dad sold that business.
Okay.
And he went to go work for the business that bought him out. And that business had a software development division, which I had never been exposed to anything like that ever in my life. But my dad was working with them and actually got assigned as a project manager to one of these software projects that company was doing.
Yeah.
And I remember coming home from work one day in the middle of Tussie using a whole bunch of products at once simultaneously, and watching him. He was working on his laptop on the back patio, and I was asking, like, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm just testing a software project. And I was like, so you mean you could just dream up or like imagine or design how it should work and build it? It was like this light bulb went off in my head. And from then on, I was kind of on a mission of like, okay, screw all this other stuff on the market.
Yeah.
Let's build our own, which in hindsight was a really naive thing. But, if you would have known what all the things you didn't know, how many times would we start doing what we set out to do? So it's not like I have any regrets, but I will say, today I sit here and think, it's a miracle that we're here. So that's how we went from starting at Tussie Landscaping to starting and building SynkedUp.
So having started SynkedUp into where you are now, what is a misconception of the software world coming from the landscape side of things that you had going into starting a software company that you're like, man, I can't believe I thought that back then?
That's a good question. You mean a misconception I would have had?
Misconception of the software world, or just building a software, what that would have looked like?
Yeah, I think I have one.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the beginning, even when we started developing SynkedUp, it was like, it felt cool. The more custom we made it, the more like, all this conditional logic and all this stuff, the more, it felt like it was cool and be so automated, so powerful. Where actually, like, the more complicated we made it, like, the better, right? Where actually, today, I'm a complete 180. It's like, the simpler you make it, the better. And so, every time you insert another layer of complexity or another angle of automation or whatever, you insert another layer of complexity. And while it may do one thing really, really well, what I learned was like, wow, like, people didn't even use it in the way I intended to use it. They used it this way, which I would have never anticipated, which, by the way, isn't going to work. So how to architect a software project that is actually fluid, can actually be adopted, like, can actually be used and adopted, and is flexible, but you can't break it because of unexpected user behavior. Is it's a real art. It's every bit as complex. Or imagine the architect of designing this hotel building we're sitting in. There's a lot that goes into it, and there's a lot of, like, just common. Well, yeah, bathrooms always have to be this certain size, or the entryway it has to be always a certain width or whatever. Like, there's a lot of those things that get figured out from many, many, many years of doing it. Right. And software is really no different. You're architecting a system, and so the misconception was, the more against the grain we are, the cooler we are, or the more amazing we are, is totally not. Doesn't serve you. Right. Doesn't serve you. All it does is make your life miserable in the long run.
Got it. Okay, so I want to revisit that because I've got so many questions for you, man. Like we could go on for many, many hours here.
Yeah.
But let's get into budgeting and the reason why actually we wanted to have this discussion because earlier this year I had a guest on the How to Hardscape podcast, Jim Houston, who talked about multiple overhead recovery system and his viewpoints on it and what he would do differently if he was budgeting and trying to recover his overhead. And I tend to agree with a lot of what he said. Some things that he says I think are maybe outdated ways of doing multiple overhead recovery system. Maybe it's been developed. But I want to know your thoughts because I know that you have your own thoughts on budgeting and recovering that overhead. So I'm just going to give this to you and let you kind of start the conversation. What are your thoughts on the correct way? I'll set you up for a spike on that. The correct way to recover your overhead, or what does that look like for a business, a landscaping business?
Well, I mean, this sounds a little cliche, but the correct way is whatever way you can use and use consistently. And so, to that point, like I told you off the podcast, every system. Budgeting is pure math. And in math, there's variables, there's inputs, and there's outputs, right? And any system, you can put dirty inputs, like pollute the math by putting bad inputs or abusing the math, the system. So any system you can break. And so to Jim Houston's point, I remember, I haven't listened to it. Whenever it came out, it's when I listened to it. So that was a couple months ago. But what he was really railing on was the arbitrary 10% or 20% overhead recovery on materials. Like, where'd that number come from? It just put it out of thin air.
Yeah.
And I'll get into that later. But like, the point is you can abuse any system.
Yes.
And you can. So it comes down to understanding and grasping the system that you are using to the degree that you are aware of the ways to abuse it or make it tell you something that's not true, and avoid them.
Right.
And so if you do that, then I don't really care what system or what method you use.
Right.
It's more of, because it's like no system is infallible.
Right.
They're all equally, they all have pros. Like it's like, I've said this earlier on some of our product meetings internally. All you're doing is moving the complexity.
Yes.
So, okay, so fine, let's not do overhead recovery on materials then, fine. Well, what he was proposing as the solution is like, all you did is move the complexity over there.
Yeah.
You know, and so, yes, you solved it. You couldn't break it over here, but now you can break it over here.
Right.
You know, and so those are some of my thoughts overall on how budgeting should work and what's the best system.
So don't mind me. I'm going to take notes just because I forget questions that I have in my head to revisit here. But one of the things that I do agree with him on is that labor. We're in a service industry. We're selling labor, and labor has a schedule, amount of hours. Whereas that's where I agree with like a labor rate, recovering overhead through your labor rate based on your schedule works really well.
Yes.
Whereas multiple overhead recovery system has you recover it through materials, and materials can be very different.
Yep.
It's very difficult to budget materials unless you're a well-oiled machine and you're doing the same design build project from project to project, right? That's where I have a problem with multiple overhead recovery system. I'd love to know like your thoughts on that.
So I'm not married to Moore's in any way.
Right.
And so I actually agree very much with Jim Houston's like reasoning behind why you should do it on labor, is because labor represents a finite span of time.
Yes. And
so there's two thoughts I have on this. Labor is very effective thing to anchor your overhead recovery to, because you have a finite span of time, like a year, to recover that year's worth of overhead.
Right.
And you want to recover that in a year, not 11 months, not 12, not 13 months. You know, recover it in a year.
Yes.
I mean, if you do it in 11 months, great, you know, and so to that point, labor represents a span of time. Like if you have 8,000 man hours in your budget, well, that means 4 guys times 2,000 hours. You know, it represents a span of time. Materials has no anchor in any way to that.
Right.
Right. So I actually agree with that line of thinking. The other thing I would say is you should anchor your overhead recovery to whichever is your most consistent expense. Yeah. Most times that's labor, but not always.
True.
You know, some people have like kind of you know, use a lot of subs, or maybe, you know, who knows, insert the variable. Like, but like I actually do tend to prefer recovering most, if not all, of my overhead on labor. That's my default go-to. Unless your business model has a a logical case for doing something other than that.
Right.
Like I'm not a fan of like what I know a lot of people do in Moores is like 10% on materials, 10% on subs, 10% on equipment, and the rest on labor. I'm not a fan of that really because the way I kind of view equipment, it is an overhead expense.
Yes, I do too.
And so you're recovering overhead on top of overhead.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird, you know? Subs I don't like unless subs, again, trumps labor in terms of it's your most consistent expense. So if your business model's all subs, well then yes. I had that conversation today with somebody that just signed up with SynkedUp that they're a total sub model. And so it doesn't work to recover his overhead on labor on man hours.
Yes.
So yes, okay. So to kind of practice what I preach here, yeah, my preferences are X, Y, Z. You know, recovering it on labor, not so much on anything else. Definitely not on equipment. But at the end of the day, what's your business model? Let's anchor your overhead recovery to the most consistent expense you have, because we don't want to anchor it to the thing that can swing, like materials can swing. Because if you anchor it to the thing that can swing, like maybe one year you do $200,000 worth of materials, and next it's double.
Yep.
But it was the same span of time, a year. Well then, most likely, on the year you did $200,000 worth of materials, you didn't recover enough of overhead. On the year you did 400, you recovered too much or priced yourself higher than you would have needed to and could have potentially lost work.
Right.
So it all comes, to me, in my way of processing, it all comes back to anchoring it to the most consistent expense, because that makes sure that your overhead recovery is as predictable as possible and lets you assign the rest of it to whatever value you're producing. Like, you know, it's not like it's priced too high or too low because of overhead recovery.
Yeah, as soon as you like start to peel back the onion, it's amazing like how much we really do agree on when it comes to this. We've talked about a lot of this off the air as well, like things like equipment. I also tie my equipment to overhead. I'd love to know your thoughts on why you see that as well.
Yeah, well, okay, so a couple practical reasons. Again, the way you view equipment expenses, there are pros and cons to every method, and I hear people like preach that the one is better than the other. It's like, fine, but it's not, and because you could be screwing it up. Then what can happen is someone that doesn't understand the dynamics of the numbers or how the numbers are working can come into that method and not be aware of the ways to mess it up, and it actually not serve them. It actually screws them up, like the financials. So there's kind of the two common ones are treat my equipment as any other expense and bill for it by the hour, by the day. When I'm bidding a job. The other one is just treat it as an overhead expense, and it gets baked into my overhead recovery, which is what we just did talk about, the overhead recovery. So there is a case to be made for both. So on one hand, the con of putting your equipment in the overhead recovery is, yes, it will jack assuming you're recovering your overhead on labor, it will jack your labor rates up.
Yes.
And in a business where you're doing both reoccurring maintenance and install, what can happen is your mowing price goes up because all that overhead and equipment that you have. And so the solution could be, well, then maybe you should build two budgets, one for maintenance and one for install. So those are ways where that's the most common reason people don't want to put equipment in overhead, because it jacks their other services up unless they do multiple budgets.
Right.
And it also does the thing of like, what if I sell a job to Mrs. Jones that pretty much doesn't need any equipment versus one that's really equipment heavy? I want the cost to be weighted. Like if I don't want to use the equipment, it brings my price down. If I use the equipment a lot, it brings my price up, which is cool. As long as, this is the cons of this method, as long as you don't tweak the numbers in your estimate, because equipment is a significant portion of the price of a job. And what I have seen many times is salespeople be like, man, I really want this job, man. It won't take 5 days with that skid loader. Just take 3. Just take 3. So they tweak it, and it has a significant impact. But then it takes 5 anyway. Right? And or this other thing that I've seen is like where a contractor is like, well, I didn't put the equipment in the bid, so I'm not going to bring it. Meanwhile, it's taking me longer to do the job. And now I wish I'd had the equipment in the bid, but I'm not going to bring it because I didn't have it in the bid. Now it's taking me longer to do the job. And so, but I'm not going to bring it because I don't want to add that cost. Well, you're losing opportunity cost by the fact that it's taking you longer to do the job. You'd almost be better off just bringing the equipment and just doing it. So you have that other billable day to go put to another billable job, even if you didn't have the equipment in your bid originally. So that's kind of the billing by the hour, by the day, billing by the unit for equipment is effective as long as you're not susceptible to tweaking the numbers and that you are factoring in depreciation into that hourly rate, because that's a big chunk of it, right?
Definitely.
It's not just fuel and repair and maintenance and operator. You got depreciation. It's a significant chunk of that rate. So on the recovering equipment and overhead, I like it because it's simple. You almost can't screw it up. Meaning, if it's baked into your overhead, however you're bidding the job, it's going to be there. And then you kind of have the mental freedom or license to, if I need the equipment, I can use it because it's baked in. But then the caveat that people often don't like is whether I'm planting a flower with a shovel or I'm digging a ditch with a $80,000 machine, the labor rate's the same. Doesn't matter. So that's what people often don't like about that method.
Yeah.
But my argument against that is that equipment is costing you money whether you're planting a flower with a shovel or whether you're actually digging it. If that equipment's sitting back in the parking lot, you still have to pay. The payment's going to be, you're still going to have to pay for it.
Yep.
And it's still depreciating.
Yep.
You have to recover it. It doesn't matter what you're actually doing in that man hour. So my argument is just bake it in, recover it, use it when you need it, leverage the equipment to its fullest. Don't get hung up over well, I didn't have it in the bid, so I can't use it. And you actually will generate the funds needed to pay for that, depreciate all the expenses you have related to that equipment throughout the year. And it's simple. You don't have to think about it. You don't have the temptation of it's not going to take 5 days, it's going to take 3.
Yep.
It's just bake it in. It's not even on the thing. It's just less moving parts, less ways to mess it up, in my opinion.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I also don't like the extra step of when you're quoting a project, having to figure out, okay, what equipment am I going to bring this project?
Yeah.
As opposed to just having it in your overhead. I also talk to people about creating either a cash flow budget or a comprehensive budget. The cash flow budget being more so, okay, I want to pay for my equipment. I want the financing to be paid for, whether I'm using that equipment or not. Whereas a comprehensive budget is more so, okay, I'm not going to be using this piece of equipment 5 days of the week. I'm going to be using it 2 days of the week, but I'm going to be able to use it for more years because of that. So I'm able to spread that out. So I'm not going to capture my financing monthly, but I'm going to have that equipment for a longer period of time, and my payments spread out over that period of time.
Yeah, so in theory,
or my overhead recovery is spread out over that period of time.
Yes. So if I'm understanding you right, let's imagine you have a $100,000 piece of equipment that you're going to pay off in 3 years.
Yeah.
So that payment is $100,000 divided by 3 years, 36 payments.
Yep.
So it's significant.
Yep.
But if you depreciate that equipment out over 10 years because you're planning on keeping it for 10, what's going to happen is you're not recovering the full amount of that payment in a year, which means your cash flow is actually less.
And profit will be less.
Your profit will be impacted.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But you're going to have that equipment over a longer period of time.
So then your cash flow is up at the end of that equipment's life. Exactly. Yeah.
As long as you pick one of those and you stick to it, as opposed to, I'm going to do this, and then it just gets confusing. That's the way I like to look at it.
Yeah, and I even, if somebody is really careful about their cash flow, I even am fine with saying, fine, put it in as a cash flow, budget for it as cash flow, but then switch to overhead recovery, or just over depreciation over the life of the machine, comprehensive, like you said.
Yeah.
Once it's paid off, so you're still recovering that.
Absolutely.
So
that makes a lot of sense.
It's like a hybrid, I guess, of the two. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to get into, I kind of do a hybrid model in Moore's personally. Now that I kind of break it down, labor rate, I recover my overhead through labor rate, but I still mark up my materials. So I don't want to make people think you're just recovering your overhead through your labor rate, and then you're not marking up your materials at all. I still want to mark up my materials to be able to make sure, okay, paver cracks, so we're going to go back and replace that. That's kind of like an unforeseen sort of circumstance.
That markup, do you in your own mind, do you view that as overhead or profit?
I view that as a kind of buffer, and I'm still kind of tweaking that in my own head as to how much that, because right now that markup's not really based on much, right? It's just based on, okay, 1 out of every 20 projects we end up having to go back to for half a day to fix a paver that cracked over the winter, or maybe something sunk a little bit. We need to go back because I don't actually have a warranty line item in my overhead at all. So I kind of do it through my materials because it's a more material tied thing. those warranty callbacks. I'd love to know your opinion on that. And I'm just kind of throwing this at you at the spur of the moment. So
my natural method would have been to do what you just said, which is say, hey, we anticipate X amount of callbacks a year, and maybe on an average they're a half a day or whatever. And so I would view that more as labor, because that callback is much more expensive from a labor standpoint than a material standpoint, even though material is what caused it per se in this month. But it's not always what causes it, right?
Yeah.
So to me, I would have put it more into the unbillable labor, like what I'm budgeting in unbillable labor.
I can see that for sure.
Yeah. That's what I would put in, because usually, not always, usually the material failure, like it's called a material failure rate, is negligible. Like it's unpredictable. It could most times it's zero, but I guess it could be significant in a bad whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
For example, larger slabs have a larger surface area.
Yep.
So they're more prone to
cracks.
chip.
Yep.
Right. Chips are more prevalent around the edges because the edges are longer.
Yeah.
So you have a higher failure rate for slabs as opposed to smaller pavers.
So you're thinking
same thing with ponds. We talked about this just at Congress. Like my callback rate for ponds right now is not so good. So that's kind of something that I would mark up at a higher rate than. So that's why I kind of do it at the material level. But this is still something that I'm kind of working out in my head, because I can see it being unbillable labor for sure as well.
So the way I'm interpreting what you're saying is it's like a material failure buffer, material failure rate, or it's like I pay for this if everything goes perfect.
Yep.
But there's a certain failure rate or a buffer that you're building in for failure.
Yep.
Or imperfections or whatever on the product. So it's like, I guess if nothing happens, it goes into profit.
Yep.
But if something does happen, you were budgeting for it.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that makes sense to me. Although I would still argue that the most significant cost in that real life scenario is the unbillable labor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. For sure.
And so what I'm more concerned about is your unbillable labor budgeted in accurately or realistically, I should say. And if there was the way I would think about it, I would probably not anchor. That's a good question. Like, I would probably not anchor my covering of material failure off of a percentage of the cost. Although I can see why you would do that.
I'll walk you through my thought process a little bit more while you think about that. Like, for example, if I have 1,000 square foot patio, 1,000 square foot, the product is $5 a square foot. Let's say that's $5,000, and I add up a markup of 10%. That's like roughly $500. That's going to cover my labor if I'm going to have to go back there and fix a certain percentage of those that might fail. So if my failure rate is, I don't know, 10%, we'll say, that's $500
per.
Yeah. That is 100 square feet that's going to fail. It's not going to be that high, obviously.
Yeah.
But that $500 is going to cover me to have to replace that 100 square feat.
Yeah.
It's going to cover my labor, right?
I would still, I can see the case for a material failure rate. I would probably split them apart. Like I would allocate unbillable labor for the labor part of it.
Okay.
Because it depends what I'm installing too. That it could swing, and it could be a 30-minute fix, could be a 2-day fix.
Yep.
Right. So I would put the labor where the labor is and put the material where the material is.
Okay.
Now, obviously, me buying new material, if it's not covered by warranty or whatever, but I'm still going to, of good faith, cover it or not bill the client for it.
Yep.
Then that would be a material failure rate angle or part of the budget. That's how. Just off the cuff here, that's kind of how my brain would dissect that.
So then getting into recovering your overhead through labor rate, do you tell people to mark up the materials at all?
Yes,
and if so, why?
Yes, so the way we think about it is like, okay, cost is what you pay for the product. If you pay $10 a square foot, that's your cost.
Yep.
Overhead recovery is the second component.
Okay.
Then net profit is the third component.
Yep.
So estimating is cost plus overhead recovery plus net profit.
Yep.
And so in materials, if you're not recovering any overhead on materials, all you have left is the cost plus net profit.
Yes.
So if you have a 10, 20, whatever percent net profit markup, it's like if I pay $10 for the cost of the material, I still add 10, 20% on top of that for my profit. So everything, I don't care what I sell, everything gets a net profit markup. It's really the only variable is what gets an overhead markup put in between the cost and profit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. You did mention earlier abusing different systems. Multiple overhead recovery system. What's like an example that comes to mind that somebody could abuse it? What does that look like in like the real world? Is that just kind of getting carried away with your numbers and different markups that you're adding together?
Well, I'm trying to think if I can think of a way to abuse multiple overhead recovery specifically, as opposed to any budget.
Any kind of recovery system. I guess.
So the biggest way I see it being, I'll just rattle off a couple. Yep. One is if your overhead recovery is tied to labor, which 95% of the time it is, right? I sometimes say, like, budget for worst case scenario, budget for worst case scenario. If you think you want to buy that equipment, or if you think that truck's going to break down, you need to replace it this year, put it in, right? If you wish you could hire an office admin, but you don't know if you can afford it yet, put it in. Like budget for worst case scenario. And sometimes I've seen this happen where people are like, okay, I got it, worst case scenario, whatever I think might happen, that's what I'm going to put in my budget. Well, then they'll go in and put field labor employees that they think they might hire next year. And what happens is when you add an employee that you don't yet have into your budget, it now throws man hours into your budget that don't yet exist, meaning nobody's actually producing those billable man hours. Yeah. So for instance, a practical example, I'm a 4-man company, but I'm thinking next summer or this summer I'm gonna add 2 more people. So I throw them in right now. Well, guess what that does? It throws, let's just say they're 2,000 hours a year, full-time employees. Yeah. So that throws an additional 4,000 man hours into my budget. Now my overhead, let's say I have a $200,000 worth of overhead expenses. Now it's being divided by 4,000 additional man hours that nobody owns yet. Yep. So it's lowering my overhead recovery per man hour, but I'm sending bids out today.
Right.
And so for that example, what I recommend to fix that is like, don't add field labor employees until you cut their first payroll check.
Got it.
That's when you add field labor employees.
That makes sense.
Everything else, you add worst case in advance, project, if I think I might, that overhead expenses especially, then you put that in.
So just what you said there, and we're probably running short on time, and I've got so many more questions that are coming to your head. Now that you bring that up, what do you think about recovering overhead by crew versus employees?
Well, that's fine as long as you have the same crew every time, all the time, no exceptions.
Yes.
If you ever, I like it by man hour. But then my antidote to the pitfall of doing it by man hour is always bid in full days. So if I work an average of 10-hour work days, and I have an average of 3 men on a crew, so that means my full days are increments of 30 man hours. So I will always bid in 30 man hour increments. If my bid comes in at 45, round up to 60, no exceptions. There is no such thing as half day billing because otherwise I get back to the shop at noon. What am I going to do? Start the next job? No. I guess you can, depending on what type of service you provide. Yeah. But always bid in full days.
For sure.
Which to me kind of then, if I'm anticipating, I think what you're thinking about bidding in crew or budgeting in crews, gives me the same benefit, but then allows me to be flexible. So if I want to do a 2-man crew on that job versus a 5-man crew on that job, or bulk up a crew, or in some bigger companies you have the luxury of having floaters. You have maybe a foreman and a right-hand man, and then you have floaters that they can go bounce around, which man-hour billing and overhead recovery is more flexible, makes more sense, it's more dynamic. Whereas with crew billing, unless you're really rigid, always do the same thing every time, which I imagine you probably are yourself. There's ways to potentially break it. Now to flip script here, on the other side of the coin is the risk of doing it by the man hour is that you only worked 15 man hours that day, and you should have worked 30. And so that means you only recovered half your overhead. And if you recover it by crew days, that almost never happens.
Right. It's more consistent, right?
Yeah.
Because you could have a 3-person crew, 1 employee leaves, quits just out of the whim. Yeah. You still have 1 crew, even though it's just 2 people. Yeah. That's probably like the biggest benefit I would see. Yeah. Recovering by the crew.
Yeah. It is kind of simpler in a way.
It is, for sure.
Especially if you're just getting started with the idea of overhead recovery, you can just be like, well...
Especially if you're an owner-operator.
Yes. Yeah. It's still not my preferred method, but I can see the case for it, yeah.
Okay. When... We kind of have the same mindset on budgeting for the future of your company. I like to say I like to budget for the company that I want to be tomorrow, not the company that I am today. I love that.
That's my favorite part about budgeting.
Yes.
It's like your permission to dream.
Yes. Now, we're coming into a time where it might be a little bit more difficult for landscape companies. Sure. At what point do companies get carried away with that? Do you have a something to stick to or something to help people, like, you know what, as things kind of get difficult, make a list of things and prioritize them as to what you can cut? Because you're budgeting as to who you are tomorrow, but you're priced out of the market. Your closing rate is going down. Maybe it's time to cut A, B, C to get to a market based.
I like what you're saying about planning your potential cuts if need be. Mm-hmm. That's really smart. But yes, that's what I would do. I would build multiple budgets, like scenario A, B, C. You know. And the way I would still say it is continue budgeting for the business you want to be tomorrow, not the business you were yesterday. Let the market tell you that doesn't work. Yeah. Meaning, like, I am consistently losing jobs that I would have fully expected to win. Although I would kind of argue then it turns into a salesmanship game, because rarely is price... I shouldn't say rarely. It can be. It depends what your persona, your core customer is, or your target customer is. But price is definitely not the biggest thing that makes you win or lose a job. But yes, it is a factor. So yes, we have to deal with
certain demographics.
Yeah. Or certain types of work, whatever it is you're doing, right? So, so yes, price has a varying degree of weight, I guess, in closing a deal is what I'm trying to say. But what I would still say is still budget for the business you were tomorrow. Only begin to change that if you genuinely can't close work. Mm-hmm. And then I like the idea of what you just kind of said is like, well, copy the budget and do a scenario B and C of like, well, if I had to, you definitely can't just arbitrarily lower your prices. Right. You have to go back into your budget, manipulate the budget to produce a lower price. Yes. That's a temptation that people sometimes use, like, whatever, I just knock $10 an hour off. I can't do that. You have to go in and like be strategic about what you're cutting. Mm. But then if you go in there and like do scenario B and C on like, well, first I would cut this. First I would cut that. Maybe I could delay making that upgrade or that move for another year or two. Or, start doing that. And then what I like about that is then you could be like, well, now I know that would save me $8 an hour. That would save me $15 an hour in my labor rate or whatever. And now I know before I'm even out there, my bottom of bottom, scenario C, like the absolute cutting everything I can cut, I cannot go less than X dollars per hour. Right. So now I know, even though I'm charging my forward-looking budget hourly rate, I know my bottom hourly rate that I cannot go below. Yep. So now when I'm out there in the market and I'm fighting the head trash, if I just got rejection, I just got a no on my third proposal in a row, what do I do? How do I respond? Now I kind of know already before the temptation to react has even happened, what my floor is. Yeah. And that can let you be a little more data-driven as opposed to emotional reaction to needing to make a cut to match the market, what the market will bear. Because the market ultimately is the answer, is what will answer that question. Right.
So is that just a matter, like I like to tell people, like, look at your sales process first. That might be your answer.
Yes, totally. 100% look at your sales process first.
And then see what your closing rate is once you improve your sales process to the point you think you can. Yeah. And then is that the point where, okay, you've improved your sales process to the point that you think you can, you've maxed out at the current time, your closing rate is still not where you want it to be, so now you take a look at your budgets?
Love that. Yeah. Like literally build a budget, then focus all of your energy on getting the leads that are the type of people that can buy the service that you sell, priced at the price that you need to sell it at. So it's like, build a budget, okay, done with that. Now, all my energy in personal development, and it goes into my sales process and becoming an expert salesperson. Going back and tweaking the budget to lower my rates is the last resort. It's the last thing I do because there's so much juice to squeeze out of growing yourself as a salesperson. Yes. So much juice. In fact, even in a down economy, even in the worst of economies, there are people out there that have money. Yeah. And it's like comes down to building the trust and the rapport to be able to work for them. Mm-hmm. And so it really becomes a marketing. Once you have your budget established, it becomes a marketing and getting really super clear on who your target demographic is. That's the game from there on out.
Okay, 2 more questions.
Yeah.
First one, at what point do people make their budgets and continuously see or estimate their projects and continuously see that, for example, the materials are at 25% and it's consistent? At what point do they just say, you know what, every project going forward, if it's this type of project, I'm just going to measure out my materials and then multiply by 4, and that's my estimate?
I would never do that personally.
I wouldn't either. Yeah. That's what I'm asking.
The only way it would work is if you are so completely cookie cutter that you're like a factory.
Right.
You're manufacturing the exact same thing over and over and over and over. So there's just so many variables. In this industry, like design, access, like you just can't do that. You know. So to me, I would say never.
It's like multiplying by square foot.
Yeah. What I would use that for, what I would actually use that for is vetting conversation with a client over the phone. Yeah, what you're describing here is a $50,000 to $70,000 project. That's what I would use it for. It's like, times 4, whatever, but never an actual quote, just because of all the variables that go into it.
Yeah. It also gives you nothing to measure against.
Yeah.
Job cost wise and everything like that.
Exactly.
Weston, where's SynkedUp going? What's the future of SynkedUp? What's the end goal of SynkedUp? This is something that I'm personally curious about.
Yeah. Well, when we started SynkedUp, like back to that conversation with my dad on the back patio one evening after work, it was a cool idea. It was like, oh, this would be awesome. It was dreaming. Then it didn't take very long to get like, this problem is not unique to us. This is a business opportunity. And then after that, it was more of as I dived into the business side of it, it was like, and I started seeing the need out there and the impact it was having on contractors. I started feeling more like, less like it was a business opportunity, more like it's a calling. Like it genuinely is so needed across so many hundreds of millions of businesses in North America, actually, that my vision for SynkedUp is, you've heard all the social media the hashtags I use, like thrive, not survive. But my vision for SynkedUp is I see a world of hardworking, incredibly skilled craftsmen that are salt of the earth people, blue collar contractors. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, just like hardworking people that work with their hands, that are extremely skilled at what they do. But by default, what tends to happen is they work 20 to 30 years of their life harder than any one of their neighbors around them, and look up 50, 60, 70 years old and have very little to show for it. And I want to change that. I want to see SynkedUp be the thing that changes the tide and the direction and the inertia of that trend or stereotype, whatever you want to call it, for the contractor industry. I want it to be something that genuinely takes these hardworking people that produce an incredible product and service that produce tons of happy clients, and make sure that value they're bringing into the marketplace also makes them financially secure and successful. And I believe that when that can happen, not only are they as an individual better off mentally, spiritually, emotionally, everything, health-wise even, but their team is also better off. Like they're actually working for someone that isn't reacting to the dumpster fires, but is actually building a business strategically and proactively. But even bigger than that, this is where maybe it's more of a personal meaning thing, is their families behind them. When dad comes home from work at 5 p.m. instead of 9 p.m. and kids get to see their dads more. Kids get to actually have a positive experience of dad owns a business as opposed to a negative experience because dad's never at home. I want to see SynkedUp be the reason that trend or kind of default path changes, and make it accessible. So there's so many times where maybe I'm a landscaper, but I'm not really a business owner, or I don't have the entrepreneurial mindset, but I'm really good at landscaping. I want to take that person and help them avoid all those common stumbling blocks and painful mistakes that person will make, void of the business acumen. I want to make the business acumen so plug and play that it just takes the landscaper and makes it totally accessible to them to run a financially healthy, driven by data business, as opposed to I don't have any money, I worked hard all year, I don't know where the money all went, I guess I'll just work harder. I'll just work harder to I'll just work smarter, and I don't have to become a spreadsheet geek or an accountant to figure that out. It's just plug and play. That's what I want.
So, what product or service comes next for SynkedUp? Does SynkedUp become an ecosystem, or does SynkedUp keep on improving on the product that is already established?
It's dangerous to try to do a startup within a startup.
Yeah.
And we're bootstrapped. We're not funded. So that basically means that for us to invest in the next product, we have to be producing enough of revenue to fund doing that, while still maintaining the one we have. So for the foreseeable future, it's definitely going to be honing what we have. I don't believe in trying to be all things to all people.
Cool.
I actually believe I've seen this as a trend in the software industry as well, which is where maybe 10, 15 years ago it was much more of like, oh, we're the silver bullet, we do everything, all underneath one roof, to more of actually, we are really good at this one thing, we're going to be the best in the world at it, and we just integrate with everything else.
Right.
And so there's a happy medium to that, but I am weighted more to we're going to be the best in the world at this one thing, and then integrate with everything else. Because who are we to go try to reinvent QuickBooks? Why would we go out there and waste all that energy on? I mean, Intuit's a multi-billion-dollar company. Why would we try to compete with them at accounting?
Yeah.
Right? Solve the problems that haven't been solved yet at scale. Don't trying to be in. Oh, we also do that to problems that have already been solved at scale takes a lot of money, And so for now, it's literally be the business operating system for contractors, which is both the know your numbers aspect, budgeting, estimating, job costing, plus the operations that we need to collect that actual data, scheduling, time tracking, proposals, invoicing, all that stuff. And refining what we have, make that be the best in the world at what we do. Yeah.
Well, Weston, thanks so much. Could talk to you for hours, man.
Yeah.
We just scratched the surface, I feel. Where can our audience go find out more about you?
Well, we also have a podcast called The Cost of Doing Business, and I interview mostly SynkedUp users to kind of get into long form stories like, hey, tell me about your business, tell me about your story. And I also like to ask, what's been the most significant challenge you've overcome? Those kinds of things. Just try to get under the surface, get beyond the Instagram profile, a little bit. And also to try to, what I see from going out there all over the country, talking to all kinds of companies, is that this thing of everybody else has it all figured out. Instagram makes it look so awesome for everybody else. We're the only ones that have this challenge is unique to us, and that's actually not true. And so one of my goals with the podcast is to make it relatable. Oh man, yeah, I'm not the only one, and draw some comfort from the brotherhood, so to speak. So that's my goal with that. But you can find the Cost of Doing Business podcast anywhere podcasts are. And then I personally am most active on Instagram. You can find it at SynkedUp, SYNKEDUP. And ultimately, you can check out our website as well, synkedup.com, and that's where most of the information is about what SynkedUp is, what it does, customer stories, all that stuff.
Awesome.
So,
Weston, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was an amazing conversation.